Okay. You're coming in. You're letting me know that you can see me and that you can hear me. That's just where you're going to be. Okay. We are downstairs again because it is still too warm upstairs. So if you're coming in, let me know you can see me. Let me know you can hear me. I'm going to get you guys the YouTube link, and hopefully everything will work out. Maybe things are going a little bit slowly at the moment. There's a Sheltie destroying some cardboard. That's always fun. Okay, all right, comments just started appearing. It's all good if you guys didn't see. I asked some questions ahead of time. It's no big deal. I was just curious what everyone's thoughts were on the subject before we got started tonight. But we're talking about obstacle commitment tonight. And last week we talked about timing of cues, and I mentioned that you can't have good timing if your dog doesn't commit to things. Because if you don't think that the dog is going to take the obstacle when you give it the information and start moving away, it means that you will chronically wait until the dog is closer and closer and closer to the obstacle before giving the information, so you will effectively be training the dog to not commit. And the dog will be training you to always be late. And that's not what we want, obviously. So we want to build this concept, and so first we're going to break down what exactly obstacle commitment is. Okay, so when I think about it and how I kind of explained it last week with the timing of the cues, there was this decision to take the obstacle, like they knew which one was next, but they don't know how to take that one to get them on the line to the next one. Okay, so they know number 2 is next, but they're not sure how to take number 2 to get them on the right path to number 3, and so on and so on and so on. So there's that moment that they know which obstacle is the next one. And Sarah's excited. So that is a separate moment, and that needs to happen as soon as possible. But not so soon that the dog's committing 2 or 3 obstacles back, because there is a point where if they're committing that far back, we've lost control over the situation, so to speak. So there's that moment that the dog understands which obstacle is next, but he doesn't know how to engage in that obstacle. And so it's our job to see that moment, okay? But then there is the time between they've landed number 1, they're looking at number 2, and now they need to know all of the relevant information about number 2 that will get them on the path to number 3. And that is the cue part, and we talked about that with the timing. And so I view that point, the point from they said, okay, number 2 is next, got it, up until the point of takeoff. Now the dog needs to keep commitment. And when I asked what commitment was in your head on Facebook, and I've read this before, that it was explained as like mental commitment versus physical commitment. And I think I want something a little bit more than that, even, because they've told me that they are going to do it, and now I need them to follow my instructions, but only after they've taken the obstacle. But if they're following my instructions exactly, they may alter their behavior on the way to the obstacle. So there's a lot of things happening here. And then I asked, do you ever want to be able to call your dog off of an obstacle? And the consensus was that we understand that if we are chronically calling our dogs off of obstacles, that we have made a mistake, and that calling dogs off of obstacles that they've already committed to will degrade your obstacle commitment. So we all agree there. So it's not something you want to be doing, calling dogs off. What you want to be doing is allowing the dog to believe you. So your job is to be believable. Okay, so kind of back to commitment. You've got the moment that they choose the obstacle, and then you have the time between that and their takeoff point. And that to me is a part of the behavior. It's not just the jumping part of, if we're talking about a jump, it's not just the jumping part. I'm also cueing what to do in between before he gets to the takeoff point. Because when he lands, I'm running as fast as I can forward. The behavior I'm looking for is for him to stay in extension and jump in extension. But if, as he's landing and choosing number 2, I'm slowing down, turning towards his takeoff point, and turning and moving in the opposite direction, effectively cue to front cross. And I don't want him to jump in extension and then turn on the ground. I want him to change how he approaches the obstacle, still take the obstacle though, and then follow. Okay, so we're a little bit talking about jumps there. I also view tunnels the exact same as jumps. So it was interesting to me that almost all of you call your dog's names out of tunnels. I want to talk about that at some point. So jumps and tunnels are like the exact same to me. I'm kind of going out of order in my notes. But then we have other obstacles too, right? Contacts, weave pulls, where we don't want them to change their behavior on the way to weave pulls. We want them to then follow our behavior after they've exited the weave pulls. Same with contacts. We don't really need to change how they approach a contact, but we might want them to change how they exit the contact. So that is it's a different concept. So right there, the dog is responsible for learning all of these different concepts surrounding commitment. And that 100% can be difficult. And so, like we talked about last week, it's my job to just try to make everything as easy as possible and go from there. So, am I making any sense at all? Realize I'm just talking, and I could just talk. I have this, when I talk about commitment and kind of being proactive versus reactive and anticipating my dog's behavior, I don't always know if it makes sense, because it feels more philosophical to me than like hard proven evidence. Um, ask me a specific question about the tunnel then, Dave. I think they should be cued in the same way as jumps. That's the bottom line there. Okay. So we also have, so let's talk about how dogs learn to land an obstacle knowing which one is next. Tunnel, so I'm going to grab Dave's comment first. Tunnels are like jumps, except the connection is lost by both handler and dog, so name can help reestablish the connection. It can. But what does the name mean, or the pay attention to me mean out of tunnel? Just on the hierarchy of things, your dog doesn't give a crap about the verbals unless you put in a ton of effort to make them care about the verbals. So I think if you're just, and if you are already looking at the dog as they come out of the tunnel, if you are already connected, what do you expect the dog to do out of the tunnel? Because I expect my dog to be looking at the next obstacle, not at me. And I think this is where sometimes things can get confusing about eye contact. And it came up in my handler mechanics forum about, do we look at the dog or do we not look at the dog? And when we say eye contact, I don't mean that the dog is ever, Smack never looks at me on course. Why would he need to look at my face? Doesn't need to stare back into my eyes. He needs to be focusing on the obstacles. So I think there's some things missing there. So simply put, commitment means that the dog has chosen the obstacle. The dog has they are looking at. So commitment in my head, they are looking at the correct obstacle that I want them to engage in. The information that I give them immediately following that observation is the cue for that obstacle that should put them on the line for the next one. And that is how dogs learn how to do that. It is very natural for young dogs to land obstacles and look at the handler and have to recommit to that line. And that is because they don't have a reinforcement history of trusting proactive cues. Or a very seasoned dog who doesn't have the reinforcement history of proactive cues will land obstacles looking at the handler because that has paid off for them. Either because looking at obstacles got them a whole bunch of call-offs, right? Do you see how this can snowball really, really quickly? That if you have too much commitment and you're chronically late with your cues, and then you're calling the dog off, and then the dog doesn't trust that you're going to have proactive cues, so then the dog learns to respond to reactive cues. So then when you finally get your timing right, you start getting refusals because your dog doesn't know how to keep commitment with proactive cues. Now do you understand why my brain, it feels foggy when I say it out loud? So I'm going to grab the tunnel comments. I think people call names out of tunnels to call dogs off of obstacles more than to give them the specific info. I'm saying when, so I want to ask, when are you calling the dog's names? Because I think that is way more important than saying it at all. I say their name in a tunnel if I want them to turn tight towards me. Same question. When do you say it? How a dog performs something, knowing which one is next, seems distinct from the commitment itself to do it and not second guess that they're going there. Committing to do it isn't the same as how, right? Yeah, I'm okay with that. So I need the dog to be looking at the thing that I want him to engage in. And then I need to be able to give, and so that looking at, it's almost like If I were doing, when I'm doing position changes, I'm not going to give Shrek the next cue until he's looking at me, because I don't think he's going to hear me when he's not looking at me. And I don't think he's going to choose to take the obstacle if he's not looking at it. If he's looking at me and then I'm doing a front cross, well, he's just going to come to me and follow my front cross. But if he's looking at the jump, his head is going towards the jump, and I start my front cross, he knows to take the jump and follow my front cross. So yes, I do think commitment is just knowing it's the next one and saying, I got it, I know it's the next one. Then the cue part of it, staying on the path, adjusting your stride, choosing your takeoff point, clearing the bar, landing, turning, and going on your way, is the behavior part of it. I use the name to look at me or change his lead if no other verbal may work. Okay, so I didn't mean to like freak everyone out that I don't call dogs in the tunnels. I want to know when you say the tunnel. So confused on how to give the dog info other than using a verbal while they are in the tunnel. Because if I say, because you can give the information just before they go into the tunnel. So if I want my dog's exit line on the tunnel to change, he gets that information just before he goes in. Otherwise, I have to have a verbal for go forward, turn moderate left, turn moderate right, turn tight left, turn tight right. And I want them to know what the exit line of the tunnel is before they go in, the same way I want them to know what the exit line is for the jump before they take off. Should they notice physical cues while entering a tunnel? I mean, that sounds ideal but difficult if they are focusing on the tunnel, since we are frequently behind them when they enter. Dogs have 240-degree vision, and they see rear crosses. They see everything going on behind them when you're ahead of them, and they do see everything. I call them when they're in the tunnel if I need a tight turn into me when coming out of the tunnel, but yeah, it's usually at the entrance. Right. Otherwise, I don't think they have enough time to adjust. Some dogs, they can, sure, but if they see it before they go in, they can make adjustments all the way through. Okay, so dogs learn about being able to trust that how they've landed, what they've landed looking at is the next correct obstacle by you being really consistent in your handling and you being consistent in not calling them off when they're headed to a thing, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. I think it's an expectation that dogs will land and look at you. But I think over time that goes away, or it should go away. That your dog should land number 14 looking at number 15 because of your proactive cue. Okay? So if we talk about when we think about proactive, we should be like one obstacle ahead of the dog in giving the information, and the dog is just kind of catching up. Even if we're handling from behind, we're handling from behind physically, not handling from behind from an information standpoint. Yeah, I mean, every dog's going to be different for sure. Nikki. And some dogs, and if we're going to talk about tunnels, some dogs will naturally continue straight out of the tunnel no matter where their handlers are. It takes a lot of effort to get Shock to turn out of the tunnel, but it doesn't take that much effort for me to get Smack and Shrek to turn out of the tunnel. But then getting the boys to go straight requires extra, right? So I'll make some grand generalizations about dogs and what they naturally know, but of course they're all individual, and then you have to layer in the extra skills some dogs know because their handlers need them to know those things. So everything is up for grabs for individualizing. It seems like commitment can easily become a timing catch-22 because it's a function of dog confidence that is a product of handler clarity and consistency, but getting hung up on watching to see commitment tends to make people late. Yes, and I think because of what Sarah is saying, we don't know what it is. What is this thing called commitment? And I think it happens because we tend to sequence too soon. We sequence before the dog knows how to choose the next obstacle on their own. And also we sequence before the human is confident enough in themselves to be clear. So I want to teach the skill of land an obstacle and look forward. Land an obstacle and be looking forward. Land an obstacle and be looking forward. If I observe that my dog's landing an obstacle and looking at me, that dog's not ready for sequencing because the dog doesn't have the fundamental skill of trusting to stay on the line. What are the steps for getting to that point, though? I think I started giving cues too soon, and now I just get a lot of freezing. So that goes, I think I just answered that, Allie, and tell me if I didn't. I think if the dog is landing an obstacle and looking at the handler, they are not ready for sequencing because they don't have enough experience on just keeping a line. So, for instance, it starts, baby commitment exercises is their reward on the ground 5 or 6 feet away, and I take one step towards that reward, and I expect the dog to go towards that reward and stay going towards that reward no matter what I do. And then I increase the distance, and then I send them around a wing first and then send them to the reward. So that coming around the wing and going to a reward, that's now 2 obstacles. So if the dog is coming around the wing and looking a whole lot at me or coming towards me, instead of assuming to stay on the line, I want the dog to assume going forward. Because if I want them to turn, I will tell them to turn. So I think it starts there. So they're going around the wing and going to the reward and going, and of course there's a whole lot into that. But basically, if the dog goes around the wing and come towards the handler and is looking up at the handler, that dog is not ready for sequencing because that dog doesn't have commitment. Okay, perfect. Thank you for telling me that I did. Placement of reward is critical. Absolutely. I think we're rewarding out of our hands way too. If we're sequencing, we're rewarding out of our hands way too soon for sequencing, usually, because it takes some planning to pre-place the reward or know when you're going to drop it out of your pocket. It's Amy has a good point. Once we start sequencing, we massively alter our reinforcement habits. Absolutely. Because now it's about us again. So we stop taking care of all those other details. It's human. It's standard practice everywhere. I'm trying to change these things. Looking at the handler after an obstacle is a function of where they expect reinforcement. If they expected it ahead of themselves, then commitment would be more fluid. I agree. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're going around the wing and rewarding from hand all the time, yeah, the dog is going to come into you. So I think yeah, I think for most, gosh, I mean, I'll keep better track of it with the next puppy, but there's just, I want, and it's all individualized because some dogs are going to be very easy to convince to go forward. It's just who they're going to be, and you won't have to have the rewards out there pre-placed for very long. But I still don't think we should be stopping and rewarding the dogs out of our pocket. We should at least be dropping it on the line so that they're reinforced for staying on the line. I want to stop reinforcing dogs for coming into me having not taken an obstacle. If they've just taken a jump and I want to reinforce them next to my body, on the side of my body, because I need to do that, super. But it needs to be on the line, not in front of your body, and not for leaving the line to come into you, because it's just not a behavior we want to see. Someone did say I rewarded off of me way too much for one of my dogs. It can happen 100%. Shock doesn't need rewards pre-placed or off of me ever again. She'll be 9 in a couple of weeks. I don't want to talk about that, how that's possible, but she's not needed a reward off my body for several years, and she probably never needs one again. The dog will go for ages. The dog has a little bit too much commitment, but that's just individual dogs. Okay, I've caught up. I've caught up on the questions. So I want to just touch, because we keep talking about proactive, I want to address proactive versus reactive verbal cues as well. And a few of you mentioned it when I asked on Facebook today if you could successfully, or if you would want to call your dog off of something. And it only happens to me in a competition when I've guessed wrong. I have predicted my dog's path incorrectly. So that means that whatever cue I gave wasn't the cue that he needed. So he has exited the tunnel wider than I thought. And I'll say his name like smack. Like, I'll ask a question of his name because I'm so surprised. And he'll be like, yeah, what? It means nothing to him for me to say his name like that. But it surprised me and knew he could carry on. And then I remember very vividly one of the, he doesn't go off course very often. He's the most honest dog on the planet. And he came out of the weave holes and he took an off course. And there was nothing I could do about it because of the strong commitment that he has. And I think about if he was reacting to that verbal, it would cause the same problems as chronically late physical cues. So if I want to add his name to a cue to say tighten him up or slow him down a little bit more, it happens at the same time as the physical cue. So if I say his name, it happens before he takes off for an obstacle, if I need to add his name to it. So he doesn't have a threadle cue. I have to handle it, but I say his name if it's a pull through. So he's coming between these two, typical threadle. I say his name before the first one. After he's committed to this one on his approach, I'm telling him to slow down physically, and I say his name so that when he lands, he's looking at my hand, and that's what it means to him, is come into my hand. And then as soon as he's looking at my hand, I can show him where the next jump is. So we have to be careful that we're not being reactive with our verbal cues as well. And that's where it gets me a little bit with the saying the dog's name in the tunnel when they're already halfway through or when they're exiting. It feels a little bit reactive at that point and not as proactive. So it's just something to consider when you're looking at your big picture and you're trying to be consistent with all of the cues and the timing of the cues. Sarah, I think it was Sarah, she said, I hate gamblers and I love snooker, and this tells you everything you need to know about what I prioritize in training. It's so funny though, because I can play gamblers pretty well. Smack has a lot of gamblers and fast things, but snooker is my like heart and soul. But yeah, apparently gamblers can die. Cool. Okay. Everyone's still with me. We already talked about reward placement. I had this like plan. We're not following it at all. So I'm checking my notes. We've talked about call-offs, proactive versus reactive, handler's role. We talked about that. It's your job to be as consistent as possible in your proactive cues, because that's how the dog can rely on being able to land and be looking and start progressing on the next obstacle. That's how they get faster, is that they trust that you're going to be okay with that you're not going to call them off. The dog's role in commitment is having those skills, right? But of course, that's the handler's role, right? We have to teach the skills. We have to maintain the skills. We have to observe when the skills are maybe weakening. I apparently did open a can of worms with the tunnel. I didn't know I had, but you guys know I have feelings about things, and when feelings come out. So on that of focusing on the weakening skills, I want to know what when you're training and your dog gets a refusal, what is your initial reaction? So what is your initial reaction to the dog getting a refusal? And I will define refusal as broke commitment to the jump. So they were looking at it and you did your front cross and started moving away, and the dog came with you instead of taking the jump and then coming with you. What is your initial reaction? I'm going to answer Lizzie's question because I think it's a good one. Commitment and distance, how do you get there? Let me rephrase. What is your initial reaction to the dog? Like, do you do something? Do you ask them again? Do you stop? What do you do other than assume you messed up? But that's okay that you do that. I'm going to tell you a better thing. commitment and distance. I don't overthink distance too hard. I just add it as a variable. So if I know that that's something that I need in my dog, so go back to that very puppy 5 feet from the reward, just taking one step and sending them, I'm usually right next to them. And that's fine for me. I can be usually wherever I want. Also, border collies, they'll tend to do stuff in general far away from you. They don't, mine are, it doesn't matter if I'm 5 feet from them or 40 feet from them, they'll parallel my path no matter what. I didn't have to work too hard at it. If I knew I was going to have to work hard at it, Shrek, I will. And it was really important to me to have a ton of gambler skills or fast skills. I would take those tiny puppy skills and I would do them the same thing, but now I'm 10 feet from the puppy. And now I'm 20 feet from the puppy. And now I'm 30 feet from the puppy, and 40 and 50. But it starts at the very beginning. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is that we raise dogs in a sterile, ideal environment. And then we go, all right, you're 2 years old, you're sequencing. And oh, by the way, I can't run. So you have to do all of this from 30 feet away. And injuries happen and shit happens and you're suddenly unable to run. I get that. But if you know it, if you know you're going to have to work your dog far from you, it needs to happen from like day one. The dog needs to be prepared for that. Okay, so we're going to, so there was a whole bunch of, we're just going to pay the dog because so we've got, in reaction to a refusal, we've got quite a few saying, well, it was my fault, so I'm just going to reward the dog, and all those things. Handling, Elise says she is going to give another verbal, but she would like to just keep some flow, loop them back to reset, and figure and send them again. Re-enter the sequence, try again, watching my timing, 2 fails, and I stop and focus on commitment. I'm not sure this will be a nice change. I give my again cue and reapproach in training. If trialing, running a whole course, we go on. Dog refuses and comes to me. I messed up. Dog refuses and goes somewhere else. Environments are my first thought. Okay. But can we pay the dog, set up again, reward in front of obstacle refused? So okay. So then fine, everything's fine. You can do any of that. You can send them again and reward them. You can just reward them. You can, all of that is fine. I think the reaction in the moment is less important than what you do when you reattempt it. So do you reattempt the exact same timing? I'm giving you guys a minute. I wasn't clear on my question before. So when you go back and you reattempt the sequence, do you reattempt it with the exact same timing? No. Are you earlier or later? And why? Lynn says, if I'm confident I gave it well the first time. Yeah, it does depend, doesn't it? Because you could, the dog might have just broken commitment. Do you see how it's problematic to just say you were early? Because a lot of times you're not early. I'm sorry. I love you all dearly, but Being early is not a human strong suit when it comes to this stuff. So it is very, very rarely that you did it before the dog was able to absorb it. I think if you adjust every time and cue later and later, you're going to have a dog that looks for exaggerated cues. Ding, 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 we have a winner. So if I get a refusal, my assumption is that the dog broke commitment. It is not my assumption that I was early. My assumption is that the dog broke commitment and needs reinforcement behind the obstacle. Because I am horribly afraid of cue escalation here. It depends on when they are pulling off the line. If it's as they land the first jump, I failed to give them info. If they are breaking commitment when they are approaching the second, the dog is probably waiting for the info for obstacle 3, so somewhere I messed up my timing. I'm going to think about it. I'm not 100% sure I'm seeing what you're describing in my head. Okay? But assuming the dog so remember, if we're sequencing, we assume that the dog has the skill of committing, of landing the obstacle and looking at the next one. So that means you are free to give the cues as the dog is landing. Okay? We're assuming the dog has that skill. If we don't have the skill of commitment, we're not sequencing. So dial it back a notch. So then if you give the cue, so the dog was looking at the obstacle, you start doing your front cross and you start to move away and the dog says, nope, not taking the jump. Are there things that you could have done wrong in the cue that caused the dog to pull off? Absolutely. But you're a human. You're going to. We already talked about your role as the human is to be as consistent as possible. So even if you and I are working in person and I think it's because you looked away at just the wrong time, I'm still going to go back and put that reinforcer on the line behind the obstacle that I want the dog to commit to and reinforce that dog for dealing with the distraction of you being not perfect. So my assumption when the dog comes off the obstacle is that he broke commitment. And I'm most likely going to cue it again the exact same way as best I can. Because even if it wasn't perfect, I still need him to be okay with it. It's likely to happen. Now, if it was a hot mess and a half and there's no way the dog could have understood what you wanted, then I'm going to change my handling. But again, if you don't have the skills to get through the sequence, you shouldn't be sequencing. Cue escalation anonymous needed here. I do it too, Elise. Like, and we do it without even noticing. But then when I review my videos, I go, ah, crap. We tend to do this more with young dogs than experienced dogs because for whatever reason, well, it's not for whatever reason. We don't have the reinforcement history of our young dogs taking the obstacles, and so we overdo it. When I say being early, I think I'm only early because Cider doesn't always have the confidence impulsion in that session, but when she does have it, then we're good. Yeah, so I would say that in those sessions where she's not at her best, she doesn't have the skill of the commitment, or she needs the criteria to be less intense, so you would proactively put the rewards pre-placed out there so that you can do your same timing, the timing that you know is right, regardless of how fast she is going, so that you're still practicing good habits and she's practicing good habits. It's just you're lowering the intensity by putting the reward out there proactively. Breaking commitment before an obstacle has a different response and reattempt from me than landing and being confused because they don't know where they're going. Yep. When dog is approaching next obstacle, then realizes a rear cross is coming, they stop. Has good obstacle commitment, except with rear crosses. It's the same going both directions. Hi, Linda. So that's my verse. Is it the same behavior going in both directions, or can he do one way better than another? And then okay, so he is the same both directions. Of course, I would first look at the handler's cues, just to make sure there's not any conflicting information, or if there is something that's inadvertently causing the dog to stop. So I would look there first. But then I would do a ton of so that same exercise of sending the dog to the reward. Can you cross behind him when he's on his way to a food bowl? No jump, no obstacle, no nothing. And just at a walk. So you're just standing behind the dog and you send the dog to his toy and you take one step behind. Can you do that? And then build it from there. Okay. I have more question. I have one more question, I think. How do you react to wrong courses? So you're training, your dog goes off course. What do you do in that moment? And what do you do for the very next repetition? Are you all typing away frantically? Usually cue, a reinforcer, transport, reset, repeat, identical. If failed twice, break it down. I think that's a pretty good response. I keep going. So my own human body is trained not to pull up at any perceived problem, and then after a few more obstacles, I stop us in a nice place and regroup. Perfect. Ignore before going again if alone. Check video. Yeah. Depending on the length of the sequence, I either start over or I just break that part down. Yep. I would do all of those things / have done those things. If I send him there, I reward, move the jump to make it easier. All of these things are okay. The only thing that I do differently in training. So for one, if they went off course and it's not the end of the sequence or the end of what I was doing, I definitely just go on and try to get the dog to reinforcement. So absolutely. If the wrong obstacle that they took was also the last obstacle, I'm also probably just going to reinforce them. So step one is get the dog to reinforcement, always. The only thing different that I would do is I send the dog off course on purpose the next time. And I think we've talked about this before, and I do it in the sense of commitment because I want to understand how early my dog is anticipating my cues. right? So if I thought the dog wasn't following me, or if I wasn't sure if the dog was following me, I would send the dog off course on purpose. So if it's the wrong end of the tunnel, the next time I ran that sequence, I would cue the wrong end of the tunnel the way I think it should be cued, and then I have something to compare it to, right? Is the dog committing to something too early? Is the dog no longer following my handling? Is the dog following my handling and my handling just sucked? These are things that we need to be able to kind of self-diagnose as we're training. Yes, Dave. So then we go into either or. So then I would handle the wrong entrance of the tunnel, reward, reset, handle the correct entrance of the tunnel. You know, handle front side versus back side, handle contact versus tunnel, weaves versus tunnel, things like that. But if you can control the wrong obstacle, you can control the correct one. And if either or training like that doesn't give you the answers, then everything else you guys said about breaking it down more and moving the jumps to make it easy, all of those things exist. But I start with either ors. I totally agree, Amy. In almost every situation, I would reward a dog for going off course. The only time I don't is when I think it's it's an anticipation problem, and I would still just go into the either or training for those dogs. I think we did all the things on my list. Yay us. So now, if you have questions, it is a good time to ask them. Did I completely muddy up your mind about what commitment is, or what it should be, or how it's perceived, or did I give you something nice to think about? It's so funny, the delay. Can you explain the difference between anticipation problem and taking the wrong course? Yeah. So my goal is that I anticipate the dog. I don't want the dog anticipating me. And so what I mean when the dog is anticipating is, let's go back to the pull through that you would do physically. So no, well, or with a verbal. So either way, but you want to cue this jump, and you start to do the false turn, and you're facing your dog, asking your dog to come to you, and your dog barrels past you and takes the jump. And that is the correct obstacle. So you're happy, the dog did it, but the dog did it before you cued it. So if the dog is taking something before I've cued it, that's an anticipation problem. If the dog is just taking the obstacles right or wrong, but I've cued them, that's just a wrong course. So when the dog is taking things before I've cued them, I handle that differently. Thank you. About sequencing too early. I think it's a unpopular opinion. People want to be sequencing, and I'm not talking about like age. I don't care how old your dog is when they're sequencing. Not really. I don't get too tangled up in knots over it, but I do get tangled up over knots when the dogs don't have the skills to be sequencing. That is way less fair than doing some sequencing over low bars. I get way more fired up about the dogs that don't have the skills. So that would be the only reason why I don't sequence with super young dogs, is because they don't have the skills yet. Anyways, I have feelings. When is the last day to sign up for bronze? 15th, right, of August, right? So, and that's consistent with FDSA, that registration, it opens on the 22nd before the month and goes through the 15th of the month. Dogs are so individual, absolutely. Perfect, someone also answered. I would label the Quaker having a commitment issue, but no, it's truly probably a reinforcement history issue. Right, I mean, you can't really splice them apart, because the solution is more reinforcement in a better location. So there you have it. So doing the right thing before being cued, like breaking a start line stay. That's also anticipation, yes. Identifying the skills as specifically is the dog seeking the next obstacle or not was a helpful thought for me. Sweet. Good. I'm glad. Yeah, I think that's the main difference, is that, and I don't think I have it on video, but I might have some video of Gletta, or heck, I probably have a video of Smack running a course for the first time. So what that looked like 10 years ago makes me so sad. And he was that green dog that he landed and he was looking at me, and he landed and he was looking at me, and he landed and he was looking at me. So of course he never went off course. But then as he started going fast, do you know what happened? The bars started falling, because then he was learning this, look forward to the obstacle. He was just learning it, and we had never learned how to handle together. So it just teach that skill first. Stay on a line. I actually want to kind of just be able to stand in a circle and turn in a circle, and my dog stays on the line. Just stay there. If I keep you on a line, stay on the line. Anyways, that's the skill I want. Any other questions? I could keep going on and on about this forever. Dog knows how to exit the obstacle before they take it because of your very specific cues, like as many as 5-7 different jump cues. If I'm talking about the verbal cues, yes, but I also teach all of the handling skills either on the flat, so no obstacles, or on a wing, on a cone, something like that. So my process with any handling skill, so because I have all the other physical cues, not just the verbal cues that we talked about last week. So you have all those physical cues, like I'll teach them a front cross with no obstacles. So once they know how to go to that reward, I will do a front cross and then send them to the reward, so that they're following the front cross, but they're staying on the line. They're not doing the front cross and coming into me. They're doing the front cross and then going out to another obstacle, things like that. Then I'll do the front cross on a wing, and then I'll do a front cross on 2 wings. So in succession, wing to wing. And then I'll do maybe tunnel wing or low jump, depending on where they are in their jump training, or tunnel jump. And then I might be doing short sequencing at that point if they have the prerequisite skill of staying on a line. Short sequences with a front cross, and then with a rear cross, and then with a blind cross, and then with all the backside techniques, and then with a forced front cross, and then with anything, lap turn and reverse wrap. Like they can learn those skills without sequencing first. Transport back. Try again if second one goes off the rails. Then there's a skill that wants to train. Oh, we're catching up. Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. If you get one more in, I'll grab it. But otherwise, I think we are calling it a night. Thank you guys for answering my questions before and during. If you have more questions, just post them in the group. If you've got something, a question about commitment, post a video in the group. We'll take a look and start thinking about what we should talk about next week. And I'll see you guys later.